A lot of things that we know of today that are kind of strange, they've changed over time for marketing reasons. Sometimes it's because there is an agenda behind the reason why they change the stories of these creatures and events and whatnot. But one of those things is the creature known as the Skinwalker. Now, growing up, like I grew up in the Southwest, and obviously there's a lot of stories. There's a lot of people who have these stories of being chased or being cursed or whatever, like just basically running into these creatures in the middle of the desert at night. They'll be driving and then they see, like, you know, a dark figure that's following them, or they'll or they have a cousin or a nephew or an uncle or whatever that has had a direct interaction with one of these creatures. I say creatures because I honestly don't believe that, like, they're all the same thing. They all could be different things. They could be aliens, they could be ghosts, they could be all kinds of things that maybe creatures we don't even know exist yet. Maybe there are dimensions that only some of us can see because we're more sensitive than the other person. You know, it's like some people, they have a really strong sense of smell and some people don't. Some people, you know, they're sensitive, their touch is sensitive, more sensitive than someone else's, or their hearing is more sensitive and they can hear things that other people can't, especially when it comes to like colors. As a designer, I know that there's people who can't see the range of colors that I can see. And I know there are people who can taste things at a level I can't taste. You know, that's where we get chefs and stuff like that. So sometimes I think some of the stories come from people who are sensitive to certain things. And I also, there's just too many variables to know if they're all the same thing or the same creature or whatever you want to call it, the same experience. But they like to lump them in together, and they like to squeeze them in together because they can't explain it otherwise. But growing up, I heard several different stories of what skinwalkers are. Like skinwalkers, the term skinwalker is kind of a blanket term for a lot of things, but I'll tell you the story that I was told when I was growing up, which I think is a different perspective than what you may have heard in your lifetime. So in the past, you know, the Native Americans, they had to survive in the desert, right? They had to travel long distances. It was really risky to travel in some of these areas. And there were enemies that, you know, like, I'll tell you a little bit of history as well. So hunting in the past was done at night because it was easier to be stealthy. Animals were asleep. It was just a lot easier to hunt, and humans were no different than, you know, other apex animals. So they would hunt at night. But for the most part, like, you know, Navajo people are mostly farmers. And they raised, you know, cattle and sheep and stuff. But other tribes and other nations, they were hunters, so they were more like what you would imagine with the bows and arrows and all that kind of stuff. But some of the technology of the past were spiritual tools that we don't have anymore because there's no reason to have them. We've found easier ways to we found more accessible ways to do certain things, right? So like we found better, we've evolved our techniques in hunting. We don't need to sneak up right behind an animal anymore. We can shoot them from a distance and be pretty accurate compared to the past, right? So we don't have to like we don't have to, you know, use certain things, use certain tools and whatnot. So these creatures, right, they were the past. So in the past, Native Americans found a way. They were in tune with they were more in tune with their senses in ways that we've lost because of, you know, like I said, digital stuff, tools, whatever, the modern age where we don't require a lot of these things. We can do a lot of these things, you know, without having to develop certain skills, and there's skills that we've lost. One of those skills was the ability to be in tune with nature in a way that is in a way that's much more connected than we are now. I mean, obviously there's certain people out here that, you know, can connect to animals in ways that other people can't. You know, you think about Caesar Milan in the past would have counted as, you know, a shaman because of his connection with dogs. And in the past, Caesar Milan would have probably been more connected with all other types of animals too, not just dogs. Had he grown up in that era. And there was many people like him, not just him. And in the past, there were even more Caesar Milans because they had to be. And so, like, skinwalkers, they were shamans, and they were people that were very connected with animals. And these shamans what they did for the people of a community was they helped to hunt. They helped to find herds of animals in the dark. They helped to see if there were enemies in the area. They helped to they were, you know, scouts essentially. They weren't really like war. They weren't used for war or for murder or for anything like that. That's just a modern invention, and I'll tell you where that sort of came from, because it didn't come from the reality of them. They were people that, you know, that were revered for their talents and abilities, and they were spiritual people. You know, they were just people that just, you know, worked on their abilities just like everyone else did. And you know, it was a practice. It wasn't like a common practice like, you know, some of the other practices, like, you know, maybe taking care of agriculture, whatever. There were different people with different jobs back then, to maintain, you know, a place, a community. So these people, the skinwalkers, right, what they would do is part of their ritual was being in touch with an animal so much that they climbed into their skin to understand them. And what they mean by climbing into their skin is like they actually acted like these, you know, like the beasts, or, you know, like a wolf or a coyote or a fox. They would actually get into the animal's skin, and it was part of the practice so that they could get an idea, you know, of what it meant to be these animals. And they would practice like the sort of habits that those animals would do, like taking care of their children, or the cubs, for instance, in a fox, or like taking care of, you know, the pups for coyotes. And they would spend time learning about the animals. They would track them. They would become so in tune with them that some people would mistake them for those animals. And the difference is that, like, these people obviously could speak, and they, you know, they were it was a type of technology in the past. And coming into, and where the story starts to change with these practitioners is that, you know, when the colonizers came, right? So like when the European colonizers started to invade and steal the land of what we call America, they brought, you know, they changed the narrative around these people. Instead of revering them as people who had mastered a craft, they started to change the stories of them. They started to change their stories to being malicious, to being scary, to being things of the night. Native Americans did not have a fear of the night. They embraced the night as a time of day where different activities happened. They were not afraid of the dark. Being afraid of the dark is an invention that is something that Europeans brought over They were afraid of the darkness because they didn't understand. They understood it differently than Native Americans did. Native Americans embraced the darkness. They knew it was a time of calmness, of rest, of time to hunt. It was a different time of the day. It wasn't something that was to be feared. So with these stories came this sort of change in the narrative that these people were possessed, that they were demonic, that they were, just because they didn't, just because they weren't Christian, they weren't part of the, colonization. The belief system of Christianity came from Europeans. It's not something that Native Americans even naturally believe in. The only Native Americans that believe in Christianity are Native Americans that have been fully colonized, and there's no hope for them, to be honest. They've completely abandoned their identities, and it's just like, so now they adopt not only the culture of Christianity and what it means against their own people, but they adopt these things like the fear of something like what they call the Skinwalker. And the thing about Skinwalkers is that there are people that have taken those ideas and they practice them, just like there's people who have taken the ideas of a vampire and they start to drink blood. The people, you hear about these people like in New Orleans, they do that, right? Like they have adopted this idea that they have to drink human blood, and they do that like in privacy or in their little groups, and it's become part of their culture or whatever. But they've adopted this idea of the vampire, which I would say look up the origins of the vampire and where that sort of stories came from, because it's different than what you think they came from. Same thing with like the Skinwalkers. The Skinwalkers in the past were people that so when the colonizers came, right, the European colonizers came, this technology was not dead, right? Like the Native Americans started to use these practices as like weapons of war. They started to use them against the Europeans, and so the Europeans demonized them as as like witchcraft, as things that they should outlaw because they were powerful. Instead of using for hunting and using for gathering and for scouting, they were used for instruments of war, and they were terrifying to these people because, imagine someone, just imagine someone like that looks like an animal that's intelligent coming towards you, and you're in this new land, and you don't even know the customs of the land. You don't know, you're barely able to survive, and now you see these seemingly creatures coming at you, and they're humanoid, but they still seem animalistic, coming at you in the middle of a war. Like, of course you're gonna be afraid. Of course you're gonna have stories are gonna develop, embellished stories to scare people, to make people fear something that they don't understand. And that's where Skinwalkers come from, is that embellishment. It's the same thing as like when they say that like Jesus Christ turned water into wine. That story is a complete embellishment. He did not turn water into an alcohol. What he did was the words were flipped, and this is what I can't say verbatim this is what he said, but this is probably what he meant. He meant that water, drinking so consciously, meaning that you're like drinking water so consciously, like you are embracing the water as you're taking the sip, as it's entering your body. You're feeling the nourishment. You're feeling it as it pours down, as it pours into your body. You feel it hydrating your body. Like that feeling can be just as sweet as wine. Like, you don't need wine. Like, the wine part was just the embellishment that someone else used so that it sounds more fantastical. But it's not. It's not fantastical. It was just, it was a story about being conscious, about consciously embracing an experience as simple as drinking water. Water can be a spiritual experience. And so, like, you know, these ideas get, you know, like the idea that like Jesus talked about drinking wine is just a story that, you know, has been embellished over and over so long that people have started to take it at face value when really it wasn't. That wasn't the actual intent of the story. Same thing with every other story in the Bible. It's all embellishments for marketing. It's all made because otherwise it would be the most boring book if it didn't have all these sort of like embellishments, and nobody would care about it. So skinwalkers, you know, they were actually pursued, right? They were actually attacked, and so they became creatures of war, creatures of, you know, of rebellion towards the Europeans. You can think of them like, you know, just like in Star Wars, they were essentially like the dark, or like the Empire. What are they called? I forget the name of it. But yeah, you can think of them like that. Like they were essentially rebel warriors. They went from like people who were just scouts to rebel warriors that were helping against the colonization of America and the stolen, you know, land. Even the idea that America was conquered is just a complete false. It's a false narrative that is just so like. It's just like people actually believe that's the case. It's just so dumb. It wasn't conquered. There was literally treaties written, paperwork written, because they couldn't actually defeat the Native Americans. So instead what they did was they made treaties that they never held themselves to, and instead of upholding their end of those contracts, they you know, they just continued to go against their word and just like and poison people, you know, with the disease that they had in their European countries. They used that as weapons. If you're gonna say like anything conquered the Americas, it's probably things like it's more so probably the diseases that they carried over that actually did all of the bidding. Because think of like millions of people, especially now, you know, we went through COVID and all these things, and how many people died. Well, imagine imagine like a land that even has less, you know, medical advancement or technology, having to deal with something like the flu. Right? There's just no way people are going to be able to deal with that. So a lot of things in history are definitely like wrong. And one of the things that I thought would be interesting would be talking about skinwalkers. Me personally, I've had experiences where I've seen creatures in the dark. Same thing as a lot of other people that have grown up in the Southwest. I mean, I believe though that they weren't necessarily, I don't believe that they were like skinwalkers in the sense of like what other people say, people that like turn into other animals. I don't believe that. I don't believe that practice is still alive. But I do believe that they were creatures that I have never seen before. I do believe that they were something that like I've yet to have explained. And honestly, what I believe is that there are way more dimensions that we are not sort of, that we're not, we people just do not experience because we're not in tune with like certain wavelengths, because just being a human, we don't have the capacity to understand certain wavelengths of reality. And I believe that like sometimes those wavelengths sort of glitch into each other. That could be one explanation. One explanation could have been that they were just coyotes, or some other animal that was just like, I don't know, like just a little different than the others. They could be animals that we've never even discovered yet. I mean, the desert's massive and huge. You never know what's out there. But, like, I always think that it's just, whenever I hear people talking about stories about skinwalkers and stuff, I think I just roll my eyes about it because, the stories that I was told as a child, like about like them being hunter-gatherers and scouts, that to me makes way more sense. And just the fact that like the whole thing of them shape-shifting into animals is definitely embellished. It was more so like that the skinwalkers were masking their scent with blood and maybe changing their appearance with fur so that they are more easily accepted by animals. Them scouting, for sure, that definitely makes sense. Even being able to cover an area in blood keeps some predators away because they or animal excrement or pee or whatever, that can, like, if you have like a predator scent, like there's no prey that's going to come around. Like if you have some sort of predator scent, like a bear pee or something, and you put that around an area, there's no deer that's going to come in your area. Like there's prey that you can keep out of your area just by using scent. Same thing could be said if you were, if you were somebody that, like if you were somebody that just didn't want sort of like other certain things in your area, you could put crazy things around. Like if you didn't, like for instance, if you were somebody, like say you had a village or whatever and you didn't want certain tribes or something in your area, you could absolutely put some crazy looking things in and around like your home base, and no one will come around because they're like, they see something that does look scary, like scarecrows, the way scarecrows work. But yeah, like I would always question, like if you have these ideas of certain creatures and certain things, spend some time, meditate on it, think about like what those things could be. Even doing just a little bit of research helps. And like I think it's important that like we continue to expand our minds. As you become an adult, like a lot of stories start, you start to learn that this, Santa Claus isn't real. And you're like, okay, why would this have changed? And you start to dig further, and just even with your own mind, you can break through a lot of these ideas that people have put into your head that aren't actually real. They don't even make sense. Things like ghosts, like I always believe that like ghosts are kind of latent energy. If somebody has been in an area long enough, I think their energy sort of lingers after they've passed. I do believe that happens, like energy moves, but I also think it does imprint in an area sometimes, especially if someone was there long enough to cherish it and to live in that specific spot for long enough. I think their energy is still in that area. It's kind of like when you have a bucket of water and you spin the water with your finger, and then you just watch as the energy sort of the water continues to flow in a circle until it sort of dies off and trickles off. I think that's kind of how, when someone is sort of walking around and spending time in an area, I still think their energy sort of, or imprints of their energy sort of dangle in the area and are continuing to like dissipate. And I think it could happen over decades and decades and decades, maybe even hundreds of decades, who knows. I think it also, I think, depends on like the energy of that specific person. I don't think everyone has the same energy. I don't think everyone has, you know, this equal energy in terms of like their vitality and whatnot. I think some people have a little more than others, and some people have less. But it, you know, it's just it's interesting, like, you know, I always listen to people when they talk to me about, you know, their beliefs and what they believe. And I used to spend a lot of time with people who were very religious, and I used to just listen to them because it was always interesting to me because they gave me new ideas to think about, to critically think about. I'd be like, why does this person believe in that? And then I'd look into their history, look into, you know, the land that their ancestors grew up in. Why would they even entertain some of these ideas that clearly are too fantastical to make sense? And I won't doubt that, like, some of them are, you know, telling the truth. Obviously they are telling the truth if they're sincere. But is it exactly as they say it is? It's just an interpretation from somebody else that they're adopting. A lot of these people have not experienced some of the things that they talk about. You know, like some of these people like talk about praying every day when they've never actually prayed, like in the way that, you know, their book or whatever suggests. They just sort of ask for things. To me, prayer is a method of manifestation that not a lot of people understand. You know, I think that like a lot of people, when they pray, they sit there and they beg for things. They beg for a better life. They beg for, you know, resolve in some issue that's theirs. When really, I think that it's about acknowledging and giving thanks to the life that you have, appreciating the life that you have. And I think, to me, that is more powerful prayer than, like, you know, especially if you have this idea that you want something in particular. You can say, like, you know, you can think to yourself that you already have it. You can believe that you already have this thing that you're wanting in your waking life. You know, for instance, if you need health for some reason, if you need like healing, I think if you're just happy that you can even think about healing and you're grateful for that, I think that's more powerful than begging, you know, for, you know, some miracle to happen. But, you know, it's just like it's a process of retraining your brain on, you know, how to think and how to deal with reality in your own kind of way. And yeah, I think that's pretty much the ideas. Those are the ideas that I had. And I think, like, so the next time you think about skinwalkers or someone brings that up, like, I hope you help share the story of what it really is. They were people that were so in tune with, it was a practice back, you know, like back in the day, that's ancient years, you know, have been used. Like, there's the evolution to become that in tune with animals. It wasn't something that they just discovered or that they had. It was developed over thousands of years. It was a practice developed over thousands of years that was lost to colonialism. Much like many other things, so many things have been lost because of gentrification. But, you know, there's a purpose in that too. And, you know, not all of it's evil, right? There's good intentions usually. And there's also there's also a lot of bad intentions. And some of them are unintentional bad intentions. but they exist. Hope you guys have a good evening, and you know, have a good night, and or a good morning if you're watching this in the morning. Peace out.